Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out to the north of Avdiivka, where the Russians have managed to make a small advancement in the first line east of Novokalinove. And with this we see that there is a continuous development of the situation on the eastern parts of the village, as the Russians are securing the eastern flank following a Ukrainian counterattack from that direction before they move on to progressing their advancements within the eastern parts of Novokalinove. We see that the Russians here are attempting to hold on to their positions and foothold within the village as they cover their flank. Moving further north here in the direction of the west of Bakhmut, we see that the Ukrainians are still holding on to their positions in the western parts of Bohdanivka, and they're also launching counterattacks in an attempt to recapture some of the lost positions within the village and prevent the Russians from gaining control of it. The Russians see this village and the final parts of it as an extremely important part for the fighting over Chasiv as it will allow them to push through the flanks of the north and south of the village by attacking the northern and southern directions. Capturing Bohdanivka will allow the Russians to then push on to the forest patches here to the east of Chasiv and allow the Russians to compete for a second crossing across the canal, other than the southern one where fighting is continuing, as the Russians continue to pressure the Ukrainian positions in the area to fight over the crossing here by the forest patch in the southern flank of Chasiv. Both of these forest patches in the southern and northern flanks allow the Russians to push through the canal line if they manage to gain control over the crossing in between the two forest patches. This is both in the northern and southern parts. There's also a series of Ukrainian fortifications along the canal, both on the eastern and western bank of it. With this, we see that the Russians are trying to gain a foothold and gain control over the eastern parts of Chasiv east of the canal. However, a prerequisite to that is to gain control over the forest patches north and south of it, to gain control over the flanks and strengthen their attacks towards the position within the east of Chasiv. As for Chasiv, the city itself is being heavily bombarded by the Russians. This is taking place around the clock. Constant bombarding by the Russian Air Force and artillery is causing heavy damage to the city itself. The city of Chasiv is spread thinly across this whole area. If we take a look at it, there is the northwestern section with the railway connected to it, allowing for the main supply of the city. Then there's the central part and industrial zone of Chasiv. There's the eastern residential area, and then there's the part east of the canal. The residential area itself is so heavily bombarded, there's pretty much nothing left of it. There's a few positions and tanks driving through that and the forest patches every so often to provide cover for the Ukrainian forces fighting on the eastern bank. However, the majority of the Ukrainian forces is in the central parts. There's also the southwestern residential area connected to Mykolaiivka, where there is still a significant presence of Ukrainian soldiers. All of these areas are being constantly bombarded, including the western parts of Chasiv. We see in this video here significant bombing of Chasiv, where the Russians are heavily bombarding every single area to the point where there's barely anything visible from all of the smoke. This bombing is mainly caused by the Russian mass producing of the FAB 500 and 1500 bombs, which allowed for the Russians to gain control over Avdiivka by heavily bombarding the fortified positions, destroying them completely. With this new development, that is the mass production and mass use of the FAB bombs by the Russians, it has allowed the Russian army to completely bombard and gain control of areas they previously could not, especially with the new reorganization of the Russian Air Force, allowing them to train some advanced pilots that are mainly working around the clock to constantly bombard these positions and fortifications all the time. As we see with these strikes, there are tens to hundreds of bombs falling every single day in Chasiv and other areas of the front, but mainly Chasiv, as that is the main axis of advance of the Russians right now. Based on the fortifications map, we see that the Ukrainians have a few areas east of the canal left. Those are mainly by the eastern parts of Chasiv, the forest patches in the north and in the south, and the north of Bohdanivka, where we see that there are these lines of fortifications and trenches. With this, we see that it is likely that the Russians will attempt to push through the southern parts of Bohdanivka to reach the forest patch, move north to fight the fortifications, which will allow the Russians to gain control over the Kaliningrad area and generally the northern flank of Chasiv and the forest patch aligned with it. As for the southern parts, the Russians are looking to gain control over the forest patch before moving down south and gaining further control over the canal line to the east of the canal before attempting a breakthrough along the canal to gain a foothold across. If the Russians gain a foothold across in the northern and southern parts, it is likely that they'll move to push in to the eastern parts of Chasiv Yar in the western parts of the canal, gain control over the residential area, before moving on to the central parts, which is the industrial and high-rise zone of Chasiv Yar, after which they will spread out to the other areas and parts of Chasiv Yar. This is if they mainly push through the central parts. There's also the possibility that they'll work on the wider flank, which was to push across the fortifications to the north and south of Chasiv Yar and move on to the villages of Stupushki here in the south, flank the Ukrainian positions towards Mykolaiivka in the southwest, and in the northern parts to move towards Ryhorivka and further westwards across the canal to flank the Ukrainian positions north of Chasiv Yar in the residential area to the northwest of the central parts of the city. Moving slightly further north, we see here that there is some shelling of Ukrainian fortifications to the south of Ivano-Derivka and Viemka, right close to the front line. This is in preparation to further assaults by the Russians. So we're seeing that the Russians are heavily bombarding all across the front line and that they are launching these constant assaults across the front. The Russians have now been in the offensive, having the initiative across the front since October, where they started the Battle of Avdiivka. Back then, Western analysts assumed and claimed that the Russians would only be able to continue offensive operations until the end of winter, after which Ukraine would regain the initiative. Instead, we are seeing that 6 months on, the Russians are still continuing their offensive operations, and they're able to continuously sustain these sort of offensive operations indefinitely. This miscalculation by the Western analysts is due to three main factors. The first one is the miscalculation of the Russian strategies. They assume that the Russians haven't improved in their tactical and strategic capabilities, and therefore they would still take a lot of casualties for these assaults. The Russian casualties have significantly decreased since the last time they were doing such offensive operation. The second one is the use of FAB 500 and 1500s. This has significantly increased the amount of damage the Russians can do on Ukrainian positions without actually fighting for them. This means that the Russians are heavily bombarding Ukrainian positions ahead of their assaults, which is giving them a significant advantage. And the third point is the Russian ability to recruit and produce their own forces. The Russians are able to recruit over 1,000 soldiers a day, and at the same time they're able to produce the necessary ammunition and equipment that they need. With all of this, the Russians can continuously sustain such offensive operation at the current rate as things are going on, with increased casualties for the Ukrainians and decreased casualties for the Russians. At the same time, the Russian attacks on Ukraine stoke fears, army near breaking point by Bloomberg, where this article talks about how Ukraine is in the most vulnerable position it has been in the last 2 years of war. There's a risk of a collapse of the armed forces of Ukraine and a breakthrough by Russia. This is according to this article. Russia's missile strikes on Ukraine's energy grid, bombing of its second largest city of Kharkiv, and advances along the front are heightening fears of the military conflict in Ukraine is close to a turning point, the agency writes. This turning point, however, is a long time ago, and I wrote about it, how Ukraine is going to be constantly on the defensive for the next coming months, and this will eventually lead to a Ukrainian collapse. I wrote about this in December of last year, so over 4 months ago. At the same time, there is this article by the BBC, Ukraine War, MPs pass long-awaited law to boost troop numbers. This is about the new mobilization bill of the Ukrainians in this article, where they are reducing the age of conscription, as well as how many soldiers that they can train to increase the manpower of their army. A senior general of the Ukrainian armed forces named General Yuri Sodol said that the Ukrainians are maintaining their defenses with the last of their strength, and that the Russians are outnumbering the Ukrainians at the front lines by 7 to 10 to 1. So 7 or 10 to 1 is for every 1,000 soldiers, the Russians have 7 to 10,000. This is widely exaggerated in my opinion and according to my sources. The Russians do not have a multiple million soldiers in Ukraine. They have about 600,000, the last I know. It may have increased to 700 or 800,000 at most, but not significantly more than that. That means that the Ukrainians, according to this general, has less than 100,000 soldiers at the front line. This is very unlikely to be true. It is more likely that they have somewhere around 400,000 soldiers. This is honestly just a random number, but it's not just completely based on nothing. It is based on the amount of units the Ukrainians have at the front, how many casualties they have taken approximately, and how much they would actually need to hold their lines as is. But this would still mean that they have about half of what Russia has, but not the 7 to 10 that this general is claiming. The main reason for this claim is likely that the Ukrainians need an excuse to mobilize and increase the mobilization. This is not to hold the current lines, but instead to prepare for 2025. The Ukrainians have enough soldiers to hold the front line right now as is. This is clear by the fact that they are holding their lines as is. They may be taking a lot of casualties and it may be very difficult for the Ukrainians, but they're still holding it. The manpower is not the main issue right now. It will be in the future, and this is why there are articles about the potential collapse and breaking point of Ukraine. But this will not be because of the manpower, but instead because of the lack of equipment and ammunition, as well as the increase of the Russian army strength. Now, what we're seeing is the fact that the Ukrainians are definitely struggling, but they are not going to see the Russians launching an offensive tomorrow and just reaching Kiev and taking it in 3 days, like some Western generals were claiming at the start of the war. But instead, we will see that the pressure on the Ukrainian side will definitely be too much for them to handle. They'll be forced to withdraw to positions in the rear. They'll have to take risky decisions. They'll have to play safe and constantly be on the withdrawal if they want to hold out much longer. If they, however, commit all of their forces to the front and the Russians open a new front, that will be very catastrophic for the Ukrainians. But in fear of that, the Ukrainians actually have a reserve force in the rear ready to respond to a new front being opened. This is why the manpower is clearly not the issue right now. Instead, this is just a preparation for 2025, where the Ukrainians plan on continuing the war. It is a message to the West that if the West continues to supply weapons, there is enough Ukrainian manpower to use them. And that is all for this update. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.